The World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, they talk about overpopulation. Does less people mean less poverty?
There will be some environmental benefits, clearly, from having fewer people. But if people are living well, why not allow more people to live well? Well, vaccines are extremely cost effective. One of the things that Gates wanted to do was also create more vaccines where we didn't have them.
Does that mean all the irreversible damages we're sort of causing day to day can be reversed and go back to normal if we recovered from an asteroid?
Well, over 60 million years, the planet recovered from an asteroid. If you want to wait 60 million years, yes, in fact, probably a lot less than that.
A person driving a Bugatti, and if there's a train going by and there's a kid that's stuck on the train rack, would it have been smarter for that person to sell the Bugatti for $1 million and save 1,000 lives instead of that one?
You're right. The estimated cost of saving a life is around $4,000, so it might be 250 lives that you're saving. That is better than saving just one life. Hey, Andy.
Hello, Peter. How are you?
Good.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this podcast today. I'm very excited to have you on.
That's good. I hope we'll get to mention the podcast that I'm doing, which is called Lives Well Lived, with my Polish colleague, Kasia De Lazari-Radek. We're a little newer to it than you are. I think we've just released maybe our seventh interview, seventh or eighth, or somewhere around that. But I'm enjoying doing it.
What was the catalyst for you to start the podcast?
It was partly the fact that I was retiring from Princeton, and so I wouldn't be teaching there, and hopefully would have a little bit more time to do other things, and also the desire to reach a different audience. Now that I'm not going to be talking that much to students, we'll still be talking some, of course, but I wanted to reach the wider audience that tunes into podcasts.
When it came to picking between blogging, writing more books, doing a podcast, just creating YouTube videos, what made you want to pick podcasts as the medium to produce content?
So as compared with writing more books, it seems to be less effort. Writing books is a lot of effort, a lot of work. And I think unfortunately, the audience for books is shrinking. There are so many other ways that people get their information and spend their time that I see it in my own grandchildren. They don't read as much as my children did, for example. It's because my grandchildren have mobile phones and my children didn't, or certainly not smartphones. So that's one factor. Another factor is, as I say, that I wanted to reach this different audience, and that looked like a relatively straightforward and easy way to do it. I felt I had interesting things to say, and I thought together with my colleague Kasia that we had common interests in what it is to live well. And so we developed this idea of interviewing people either who have lived well themselves or who've done research into what it is to live well. And we've been very fortunate in finding lots of interesting guests who have been willing to talk to us about that.
Is it planned to be 100% guest based where each episode would have a guest, or will there be some episodes where it's just you and your co-host?
So the first episode was just me and my co-host talking to each other about what we were planning to do. And we may do some others which are more philosophical discussions between me and my co-host rather than having a guest. But so far we haven't done that because we've had lots of guests that we wanted to talk to and who were willing to talk to us. And so we wanted to go ahead and talk to them. That's in a way that's perhaps more exciting for us because we learn things from them, whereas we know each other's views and ideas quite well. So we perhaps learn a little bit less by talking to each other.
That's so cool. Were you always inquisitive ever since you were a child, Peter? Did you always have these philosophical questions and thoughts about life?
I think I was always inquisitive, but I wasn't always inquisitive in a philosophical way. As a child, I was particularly interested in history. I read quite a lot of history, but my parents, I don't know how old I was, maybe I was 8 or something. My parents got the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is big 26 volumes set or something like that. And I started reading in volume A, and my sister says that I read it all, but I don't think that's actually true. But I did just start reading and probably skipped some articles that were less interesting, but I did suddenly the home had this huge, for the time anyway, huge compendium of human knowledge, and I was inquisitive and interested in seeing what was there.
Talking about reading and talking about how your grandchildren read less than your children and so forth. I've been forcing myself to read. I don't think I naturally enjoy it, but I force myself to read each night and I'm building that habit. There's the option of audiobooks, listening it on 2 times speed. Is there is there more retention when it comes to reading? Is reading better in any sorts compared to watching a documentary?
It certainly is for me. I do retain better when I read. It's possible that that's simply because those are the habits that I had as a child and, well into adulthood, of course. And now with more audiobooks, some people have trained themselves to retain well what they hear, but I certainly don't. I retain better what I see on the printed page. The other thing is, of course, that if you want to take notes, you can just put aside the book and type your notes into your laptop or put them on a piece of paper. If you're listening to an audiobook, it's just a little more trouble to pause the audiobook and say, oh, that's something I want to write down, and then resume. And of course, if you're listening to the audiobook while you're jogging or driving, you can't do that. So I think there's probably less note-taking with audiobooks than there is with, this would apply to, less with audiobooks than there is either with the printed page or with a digital book where you can also easily take notes.
Yeah, I know Bill Gates likes to write notes on the sides of books as he's reading, and my friend does it as well. Do you find it more effective to read twice as many books but don't note take, or read half the amount of books and note take and just underline things that you find important?
I think probably the latter. I focus my reading on things that I am interested in or want to know about, and I tend now to read with specific questions in my mind. So I'm looking for whether this book provides an answer or some clues at least about some specific questions. And so that's why then, if they do, I certainly want to sideline or underline that, maybe put in a sticky note, or maybe, and this I find most effective really, is to type it into my laptop somewhere, because then it's easier to find. I can search for it. If I have just sidelined a passage, I have to pick up the book again when I want that sometime later and find the passage. It's much better if I have a note and I can remember, oh, this was in a book by this author or with this title, and then I just search for notes on that book and it immediately appears. So I think that's the most efficient way for me to take notes on what I'm reading.
Got it. So you have I guess a document where you can control F and search for any of your previous thoughts or notes that you've jotted down. With AI and ChatGPT, would that eventually become obsolete where you can just ask ChatGPT any of those things that you would have control F'd on your own document?
It may, yes. I have started doing that, particularly for quotes that I know there's a quote somewhere. Maybe I don't. Maybe I remember the quote, or maybe I remember the author of the quote, but not the full quote. And certainly ChatGPT can help you find some of those things. And even if you don't remember it exactly, if you have a vague sense of what it was, you know that there was some book in which somebody, let's say, where is the example where a philosopher objected to utilitarianism that then people would be able to plug into some machine that would give them all the pleasures that they would want to have, right? And if I put that into ChatGPT, it'll tell me Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State and Utopia described an experience machine, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, those things can be very helpful if you just have a vague memory and not a specific enough memory to easily be able to search for it.
Got it. I had a friend that is a big fan of yours, and she has a question that's related to that. To give context, how I first came across you, Peter, I was at the Blackbird event and I met this girl named Caroline, and she was heading to your event. She was like, hey, do you know Peter Singer? I'm going to his his talk. I'm going to show up 30 minutes early. I want to, get a good seat. I want to see him. I'm a big fan. I've read a lot of his books. And because of her, I sort of tagged along, and then I sat in the front row, saw you sat down and spoke, and then loved the sort of opening video about the girl drowning and, that story. And then I read your book, and then you did a book signing. So that's the context on how we're here today on this call. And I asked Caroline, I was like, hey, if you have one question to ask Peter, Mr. Singer, what would the question be? And her question was, should we be making robots or AI that are capable of feeling or sentience? Would that make them privy to the same rights as other living species? So I'd love to ask you her question.
Yes, I think the answer to that is, if we do make robots who are sentient beings, who can feel things, as you say, have emotions, feel pain, suffer in various ways, maybe feel lonely or fearful, then they would have the same moral status as other beings who have those emotions. And all of those emotions non-human animals may have. Some non-human animals certainly have them. And so they would have at least the same moral status as non-human animals, which, as you may know, I think should be much higher than it generally is in our society, or indeed in any society anywhere in the world. I don't think we should be using sentient beings as if they were just things for us to consume in some way, to eat or to experiment on or to entertain us. So when I say that I think these sentient robots should have the same status as non-human animals, I don't mean the status that non-human animals have today. I mean the status that I've argued in various books like Animal Liberation, and more recently Animal Liberation Now, the status that they should have, that I believe they should have.
On the topic of animal liberation, like, are all animals equal? Like, is a spider equal and as valuable as a cow? And like, is a mushroom as valuable as a fly?
Well, a mushroom is not a sentient being. I don't think. A fly may be a sentient being. We don't exactly know. So the answer to that is easy. I think say no, a mushroom does not have the same status as a possibly sentient being, because I think it's pretty clear that mushrooms are not sentient beings. Of course, you might say, well, what if we got evidence that they are? That would change things. Clearly, you have to be open to the evidence. Has a spider the same status as a cow? No, I don't think so. I think cows have a range, or let's say we know that cows have a range of emotions and concerns. For example, we know that if you take a newborn calf or recently born calf away from their mother, that causes distress to both of them. And the mother in particular will call for her calf repeatedly for days or for months, even, accounts from dairy farmers, because this is absolutely standard in the dairy industry. You don't get milk unless you make cows pregnant, and you take the calves away at an early age, because otherwise you don't have milk to sell. The calves drink it. So dairy farmers, who are honest, will tell you that if you have a cow who's had a calf taken away at some particular place, and the calf passes that place even days or weeks after the calf was removed, the calf may stop and look around. Sorry, the cow may stop and look around for the calf and call for the calf who was taken away. And so there are clearly, maternal bonds, child mother bonds that exist in all mammals, I would say, but that spiders, not being mammals, don't have these kinds of emotions. And it's very hard for us to know what spiders are actually experiencing. Again, I would say they're perhaps like a fly. They may be sentient, they may be capable of suffering and feeling pain, but we can only say that there is a possibility of that. We can't say with high confidence that they do, as we can say that for a cow, or pretty much for any vertebrate. I would say we can say we have very good reasons for believing that they're capable of feeling pain, and we don't have the same reasons for insects or spiders, which is not to say that there aren't some invertebrates where we have good reasons. I think a lot of people have seen the film the octopus, my teacher, which suggests that the octopus does have feelings and emotions and so on. And that seems plausible given a lot of well-documented octopus behavior observations. So that may be true of octopus, it may be true of lobster, that they have capacity for feeling pain. The United Kingdom government recently included them as sentient beings in a piece of legislation that it passed. So I'm not saying that this is true of invertebrates generally, but I think it's true of insects and spiders, that we can't be really confident about whether they can feel pain.
What does it mean to be sort of sentient? Like, for example, I've heard that trees in a forest sort of speak to each other. You know, when there's a tree that is sick or dying, the other trees would send that tree sort of energy. Are trees alive?
Well, trees are certainly alive, but that's different from being sentient. Yes, mushrooms are alive as well. All plants are living things. There are bacteria are living things. If it comes to that, we talk about killing bacteria with antibiotics, for example. So yes, but being alive does not mean that there is a center of consciousness there. So when I talk about sentient beings or consciousness, I mean that there is a subject of experience. There's something that it's like to be that being. For example, let's say you live with a cat and the cat is lying on the floor and you accidentally tread on the cat's paw and the cat makes a noise and jumps up and maybe licks the paw. You know that there's something that it's like to be a cat whose paw has been trodden on. You don't know exactly what it's like because you're not a cat, but you certainly know that there is some sense of feeling of pain there, and the cat is reacting to the pain of having the paw trodden on. So that's what I mean by consciousness. By there is something that it's like to be that cat. There's nothing that it's like to be, let's say, a tennis ball. Last night the Wimbledon final was played. There was a tennis ball that was hit very hard many times, or many different tennis balls, I suppose, during the course of the match by the two players. But there's nothing that it's like to be that tennis ball. It didn't experience anything. So that's the difference between a conscious being and a non-conscious object. And I think, to go back to the trees, I think they're more likely to be in the non-conscious capacity. I don't think, you said they speak to each other. I think that's metaphorical language. They may send out some chemicals that may be transmitted that may act in some sense as causing responses in other trees. Let's say, I think what's sort of documented is if one tree is infested with a certain kind of insects or a certain disease, and it activates something to make those insects or the disease to resist them, other trees may respond to that, may sense that in some sense, and also make that response. That's true, but that could be just a series of chemical reactions. It's not proof of consciousness. And if we, in the absence of a brain and a centralized nervous system, it's much harder to be confident that there is some capacity for consciousness.
Interesting. I remember hearing this study about psilocybin, magic mushrooms, where these researchers in Japan sort of put them into sort of put them on Japan or Tokyo, and the psilocybin somehow built these sort of networks and routes, and they built a more efficient public transport or train route than what existed already in Tokyo. What is happening there? Is the psilocybin, these magic mushrooms, are they smart? Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that, and I'm not going to comment on it. I'm somewhat skeptical that this really happened in the way you described, but I think it's better I just don't comment on things I don't know about.
And I probably might have butchered the sort of thing I heard as well. When it comes to sort of sentient beings, what would be a bigger problem? 300 million cows being, killed each year, or 5 million kids who are dying prior to the age of 5. Is a kid worth 60 times more than a cow? Are they both equally sort of
No, I wouldn't assume that they're equal. There's perhaps a lot more awareness of in the child and the parents of the child than the cows. There may be. I mean, there may not be, but certainly I think it depends a bit what age the child is really, in terms of the kind of awareness of their life and of what they're losing out on. And of course, but the awareness of the parents is going to be different anyway. So I don't equate lives where you're talking about beings being killed. What I do say is that where there are similar quantities of suffering or of pleasure or happiness, that they count equally. But it's still a difficult question to say where the suffering of a cow and a human being is similar and where it's not. I've given you already one example of where it might be similar in terms of the separation of the mother and her child. But even there, it's possible that the mother will remember this and be traumatized by it, the human mother, in a way that the bovine mother is not. So we can only make rough approximations in many cases. But what troubles me is that even where it's very clear that the suffering of the animals is severe and prolonged, and this is generally true in industrial factory farming of animals, which is the overwhelming majority of animal production in the world today, that we're doing that, we're inflicting immense amounts of pain and suffering on them for no real benefit for humans. In fact, I would say for a detriment to humans, in terms of wastage of food that has to be grown to feed to the intensively farmed animals, in terms of environmental pollution, in terms of the appalling conditions of industrial farm workers, and it's not really beneficial for us or our health either. So that's why I focused on those cases where I think the equation is very clear that there's a lot of suffering on one side and this is not at all necessary on the other side. It's not a life against a life or even 60 lives against one life. It's a vast amount of suffering against something that really, if we looked at it in a cool and dispassionate way, we would see was not actually doing us any good at all.
Is suffering sort of just innate to life? Is it sort of, there's the experiment where if you have 100 people in an island, you give everyone $100 each. Within a few months, all that money is going to be accumulated to 2 or 3 people, and everyone else is going to have no money and they're going to suffer. You saw that during COVID, they printed a ton of money and all the big organizations sort of gobbled it up. The money just sort of flow upstream and there's people left without money, sort of in a tough situation as we speak. Is suffering just a part of life?
Well, there's a few things I'd want to question in what you just said there. Firstly, obviously, suffering is not a part of life because, as we have said, plants are living things, and yet I don't believe the plants suffer. Insects are living things, and I'm not sure whether insects suffer. So you can certainly conceive of living things that are not suffering. But if you said is suffering a part of human life, or is it a part of the lives of beings who are conscious? I would say some suffering is likely to be unavoidable in any of these beings. Just perhaps being born involves pain and some degree of pain and suffering for the mother anyway, and maybe for the newborn child as well at first. Children come out often crying because birth has been a distressing experience for them too. So yes, there is some, but I think we can nevertheless do what we can to minimize it. And I don't think we should be fatalistic. And to go back to your example, I don't actually believe that it's inevitable that in any community of people, eventually 2 or 3 will have all the assets, and the other 97 or 98 will be poor and starving. I think there are many societies in which that is not the case. Here in Australia, we live in one of those societies. There are very, very few people who are so poor that they are hungry and can't eat. And if they are that way, it's probably because they have some problems, maybe mental health problems or substance abuse problems, which prevent them from accessing the public welfare services which are available and would provide them at least with enough to feed themselves and not be hungry. No, it's not. It's not inevitable that that life is going to be full of suffering or have more suffering than joy. And I hope as we continue to develop, that will be less and less frequently the case.
Interesting. Yeah, I always thought that if you give money and you print money, it's not going to really sustainably help people that are struggling, I guess. Let's say money doesn't flow to the top, and if you give money, the person who gets it actually receives it. I always thought of that saying, you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, you teach him how to fish, he's fed for a lifetime. Is that true when it comes to sort of giving and buying mosquito nets and buying sort of vaccinations for people in third world countries, that they're always going to need more?
No, it's not necessarily true that they're going to need more. If what you're giving is given to an organization that uses the resources well and that has plans to have a positive impact, then your donation can make a life-transforming difference to people. So in the case of giving out bed nets against malaria, you can certainly save lives by doing that, save the lives of children. That may not in itself be enough to get them out of poverty, but not having malaria is certainly a beneficial situation to be in, not just for children, where it's the children who are most likely to die. That's why we talk about saving children's lives with bed nets. But adults who get malaria are very sick, they're weak, they're incapacitated. So preventing them getting malaria might help them to work their way out of poverty. And there are other programs that have been well studied where people are given help in setting up a small business. Perhaps they're given a loan, or they're given some capital items, and they're then mentored to see that they know what to do and are given advice. And some of these programs do get people out of poverty so permanently. So that's what we've been looking for in The Life You Can Save, the organization that I co-founded. And we've curated a list of 20-something organizations that do make life-transforming differences in the lives of people and help them to, in many cases, to escape poverty or certainly to have better lives. So no, it's not that they always will come back for more.
Watching Bill Gates' Netflix documentary, it seems to emphasize a lot about sort of vaccines, and that's what he's been really focused on within third world countries. Has vaccine been the most cost-effective, cost-efficient way to sort of save the most lives per dollar? And is that why he's doing that, or why is vaccines the most cost-effective process?
Well, vaccines are extremely cost-effective. It's hard to say that they're the most cost-effective thing you can do. There are other things I've already mentioned: distributing bed nets against malaria, restoring sight in people who are blind, where perhaps they simply have cataracts and it's quite easy and inexpensive to enable them to see again. It's very cost-effective. There are various health interventions that can be extremely cost-effective, including just providing information for people about what they need to do to promote their health. So there are many things, but vaccines are certainly one of them, and I think that's why the Gates Foundation went into that. You need to distinguish really in terms of cost effectiveness between those cases where we have the vaccine, we know it's effective, and all we need to do is to get it into more people. And that's one thing that's been done. And to some extent, the lowest hanging fruit has been picked there. By the lowest hanging fruit, I mean the places where the disease is most prevalent that you're vaccinating against. Let's say it's measles, for instance, where it's most prevalent, and where the people are accessible. So, you're not talking about small villages in remote areas that you have to hike into for several days to get to them. So that some of the lowest hanging fruit has been picked, and therefore it becomes more costly with each to inject one of the other people, more costly to save lives, because either the disease is less prevalent or it takes more effort to get to the people who you need to vaccinate. And at some point when that is happening, then maybe something else will become more cost effective than vaccination. But in general, when we know that we have the vaccine, it is highly cost effective to distribute it as widely as possible. And one of the things that Gates wanted to do, to his credit, was also create more vaccines where we didn't have them for neglected tropical diseases. Because if something is a disease that affects people in the United States or Europe, there'll be billions of dollars going into research to find vaccines for that. We saw that with COVID, of course. But if something only affects people who are very poor, there's not going to be billions of dollars going into it because, firstly, the drug companies aren't going to be able to make money by selling it because the people are too poor to pay a significant price for it. Secondly, the governments and research institutions of affluent countries are not going to be so interested in finding a vaccine because they tend to focus on the diseases that affect the citizens of their own countries. So that's why you can often get very good value in assisting people who are not in affluent countries. And I think that's what Bill and Melinda Gates realized, that there were people dying from diseases that did not yet have vaccines in some cases, but where there was a good chance that you would get a vaccine if you put some money into research. And that they did that, and it's starting to pay off. We now have vaccines against malaria, for example, which didn't exist when the Gates Foundation was set up. And that's largely the result of their work, significantly impacted by their work. The vaccines could still be improved and made more effective. They're not 100% effective or even like 98% effective. But we have them and we're starting to distribute them, and they're definitely saving a lot of lives.
Talking about these third world countries, it seems like these third world countries are rich in resources. Like they have so much coal, minerals, diamonds. Like in Mongolia, they have tons of sort of natural resources. Like these are rich countries, yet it's like the people are very poor, and all these resources, I guess, are owned by first world countries, whether it's America or China. They own all the mines. Like, is that the root of the problem? Like, how can these third world countries be the countries with the most resources? Like, how does that make sense? And shouldn't we be solving that if we can?
Well, there's a lot of things that need to be said about that. Firstly, it's not always true that the resources are owned by Western countries. I mean, you take, for example, Equatorial Guinea, which is quite a small African country. It's a population of, I think, somewhere around 1 million, or not a huge amount more. But it's ruled by a dictator who is basically keeping the wealth for himself. It's not going to Western countries. It's being kept by the ruler, and so the problem is a dictator who doesn't care for his people, but has got the loyalty of the army or the armed force because he pays them well. So in some countries, that's the problem. It's poor and corrupt government rather than Western countries controlling all of the resources. Another problem is that, in fact, simply digging up and selling your natural resources is not a good way for a country to become prosperous, because often when you do that, it creates something that is called the resource curse. That is, it's been studied that countries that develop natural resources when they don't have a flourishing economy in general. So it's a country that is rather backward economically, but then they discover gold or diamonds or oil or whatever it might be. That means that because people want to buy that the currency goes up. It's hard for those countries then to establish manufacturing industries because their goods don't compete with goods from other countries. And yet manufacturing industries tend to employ far more people. So you see countries that are actually doing better economically because they have low labor costs and can sell goods to richer countries. That's been a major source of China becoming more prosperous, but also countries like Bangladesh, for example, that have done a lot better than many people predicted they would do 30 or 40 years ago. And they don't have rich natural resources, but they do have a skilled labor force. And so they can make textiles and clothes and sell them to wealthier nations. So it's, that seems to work better in terms of creating a thriving economy than discovering mineral resources. And the other problem with discovering mineral resources is it does often create the situation that I mentioned before, where a dictator will get hold of the country and acquire most of the wealth, because there's a reward for controlling the company. The reward is that you can then sell off the mineral resources, and you can keep the money that is earned by selling them off. And so you find a higher number of, or higher risk of military takeovers, army coups, because the rewards for succeeding in such a coup are enormous, and people are eager to try to share in those rewards. Whereas countries that have no such natural resources, there's no huge benefit in taking over the government. You doesn't make you super wealthy because you don't have anything very much to sell to the wealthier nations.
What makes a country prosperous or thrive? Like, why is Australia so lucky? Like, we initially were just convicts from England. Is it luck? Like, what makes us different to third world countries? And if it's just luck and in history, is the solution to have a globalistic approach and try to get all the world to be one country?
So I think there's been some element of luck in Australia's prosperity. We initially became prosperous because we produced agricultural goods like wool in particular, wool and wheat, which we sold into the world markets. And that was one factor. And then when the price of wool started going down because of synthetics, we found iron ore and coal, which we started exporting. But unlike those countries I mentioned, the low-income countries, we had some important things that they didn't have. For one, we did have a manufacturing industry. Our economy wasn't dependent on agriculture or natural resources like iron ore and coal. And also we had good governance. And I think that's very important, that we had the rule of law, we had security of property, we had armed forces that understood and accepted that their role was to be subordinate to the civilian government. We've never had a military coup. Certainly, arguably the Rum Rebellion in colonial days was an attempt at a military coup, but since we established legislatures and democratic procedures, we've never had a military coup to try to take over the country. And generally, people believe that if their rights are violated, they can go to court, and the courts are not corrupt and will hear their case. They won't be arbitrarily arrested and thrown in prison or have their property confiscated by their political opponents. So I think all of these things are extremely important in enabling a country to flourish. That security of possessions, property that rewards industry, the rule of law, the basic rights of the person. I think all of those things are important.
If we would swap Australia's population with a third world country's population, it would look like that probably Australia would go downhill as a third world country comes in, and the country that we now occupy would figure itself out and would make it work. Does that mean there is a sort of culture or religion or sort of ideology that is good, and do we want to sort of make that global?
Well, as I was saying, I think the institutions that countries like Australia, Canada, Europe, European nations mostly have, United States. I think those institutions are really important. And so you have a population in Australia that is used to them and accepts the importance and the values there. And if you did transplant that population to another country, they would probably set up similar institutions and would become prosperous. And if you brought in people who have no such culture of rule of law, democratic rule, as I say, subordination of the military to the civilian government, security of the rights of the person and of property, then maybe we would not have a prosperous country in the geographical area occupied by Australia. So those things are important. It would be good if they spread, but trying to impose them on other countries has not generally worked very well. I think the most recent example of that was when George W. Bush and his cabinet tried to impose There's on first Afghanistan and then Iraq. Neither of them worked very well because imposing something by military means on a foreign culture is generally resented. I don't think we can do it that way. I think we should rather try to spread these institutions by example and education, but not by basically what you might call colonial methods.
Yeah, like how is like a constitution built from a ground up? Because I when I drive, I don't speed because I know I'm going to get a fine, and I don't want to get a fine because it's going to cost money to pay the fine, and I trust that the money has value because everyone in Australia values that money, and we trade it for food, and I pay the fine because I know if I don't, a policeman will show up at my door and sort of hurt me. So like I believe in all these things. Like, yeah, it's we've built something that seems like impossible to recreate in a third world country, and it's crazy how we've built it from nothing.
Well, we built it over many years, not exactly from nothing. And it's not impossible to create in a third world country. I mean, if you look at countries in the third world, some of them have adopted institutions that are somewhat like those of Western nations. I mean, I don't want to defend colonialism, but some of those institutions did stick despite an immense amount of damage that was done. And you do have democratic countries. The largest of them is India, where I would say democracy is under some pressure just at the moment, but it has been a successful democracy since independence. It's not perfect. There is perhaps a higher level of corruption than there may be in some other countries, and that would be desirable, but it's certainly made a lot of progress. And if you want to look at African nations, countries like Ghana, for example, which are democratic and have a civil society. So it's definitely not impossible for third world nations to take up these institutions, but it may take a certain kind of culture that makes that more acceptable in some places than others. It may take higher levels of education. It's hard to know exactly what the factors are.
On the topic of constitutions, is it possible to really own anything in today's world? Like, let's say I own my house, but let's say I don't want to pay the council rate, the land tax. The fees are going to stack up. I'm going to get late fees. Eventually, a policeman's going to show up at my house. I'm going to stand my ground and say, no, this is my house. Don't come in. They're going to send 5 policemen in a car with guns, and eventually I'm going to have to be dragged to court. Like, even though I bought the house 50 years ago, I bought the land, I have the paperwork for it, they can just take it away. Do we truly own anything in this world?
You could debate what the meaning of the word own is in this sense, but yes, you do own your house in the sense that if somebody else just walks into the house and says, get out, I want to live here, you can show that you bought it, that you have a title to it. And in fact, those policemen you mentioned will come and remove the other person who does not have the right to your house. Now, if, as you say, you don't pay the taxes that are levied by the local government or the state or federal government on your property, you may lose it. That's true. But even there, you don't lose your right to it, because let's say for some reason you haven't paid these taxes and they've mounted up and they've mounted up and they amount, let's say, to hundreds of thousands of dollars. But you can put your house on the market and sell it. And, if your house is in Melbourne or Sydney, you will definitely get enough money to pay off those hundreds of thousands of dollars that you owe. And that money will be yours. Now, then you pay it off, but whatever is left over is yours. So that shows that you did own the property, and because you foolishly didn't pay your taxes, then you may have to sell it. But it doesn't show that you didn't own it in the first place. In fact, the fact that you can sell it shows that you did own it.
Got it. I love how your knowledge is so broad, Peter. Like, what does your knowledge consumption look like daily? Are you reading 50 pages each night? Are you constantly reading the Daily Mail? Like, what is your daily consumption of content like?
I don't have any particular quota of pages that I read every day, and I wouldn't really know how many pages I read every day. There's probably some days when I read very few, and other days when I read a lot. Where does my knowledge come from? A whole range of different sources. I do continue to read books, particularly those in areas that I'm working on or researching or that are highly recommended to me. I read a lot of articles online. Again, people email me links to articles that they think I might be interested in. And I look at a couple of newspapers pretty much every day. I have a subscription to the New York Times. I look at that on a daily basis. I subscribe to the Age Sydney Morning Herald in Australia, so I keep up with Australian news through that. I also get The Guardian online. And sometimes I look at BBC World News. So I have a range of sources for what I know.
Given that your podcast is sort of about, living a happy life, has your approach to life changed before and after retirement, or is your routine quite the same?
So my routine has changed, certainly. I'm not preparing courses or teaching courses. I suppose even when I was teaching at Princeton, especially when I was full-time, it was a major part of what I was doing was either teaching a course or preparing a course, because there's a lot of work that has to go into preparing a course in terms of drawing up the syllabus, drawing up the reading lists, what you want students to read on every topic, and the administration, running of the course, the actual lecturing, taking seminars yourself, and of course the grading of the students' work. So that's all quite time consuming, and I'm not doing that now. But I'm doing a range of other things, and one of them is the podcast Lives Well Lived, which involves discussing with my co-host, Kasia De Lazari-Radek, who we're going to interview, inviting them to do an interview, then preparing for the interview, which will involve reading things that they've written so that you know the appropriate questions to ask them, and actually doing the interview. We do employ a producer who edits the interview and puts it online, but we check the work that she does, so listening to the recording of the interview. So yeah, that takes a fair bit of work, and I would say certainly not as much as being a full-time teacher, but some. And then I'm still writing some things. I write a monthly column for something called Project Syndicate, which syndicates it to other newspapers, but also puts it online at its website, projectsyndicate.org. I have a blog, a Substack blog called Bold Reasoning with Peter Singer that I haven't had as much time to write for as I would like, but I'm planning to write more for that. I'm doing a fair amount of posting on social media to try to get my ideas to a wider audience and to support causes that I think of as important. I do some work for The Life You Can Save. As I say, I co-founded that organization. I'm the chair of the board. I don't run it on a hands-on basis. It has a couple of CEOs, actually a couple who are running it and who don't take a salary for running it. They're essentially doing it voluntarily. But I'm involved in a lot of discussions that go on about that through being on the board. I'm also involved in discussions about the treatment of animals and trying to improve that. At the moment, I'm planning a tour of China where I'm going to go to talk about animal ethics in October. So there are many different things that keep me busy each day.
Given that you're sort of surrounded by, seeing, animals being mistreated, animals being killed, poverty, war, how do you stay happy despite being surrounded by that? Do you meditate? Do you practice gratitude? Do you try to live in the eternal now? Yeah.
No, I can't imagine living in the eternal now. A lot of as I just said, for example, I'm preparing for a trip to China in October. If I was living in the eternal now, I would find myself in China with no preparation and not knowing what I was supposed to be doing. I occasionally meditate more to relax a little bit, and maybe especially if I'm not sleeping well to make up for lost sleep. But I think what keeps me going, what drives me, is the sense that it is possible to make a difference. Yes, I know that there's a lot of suffering in the world for animals, for humans in extreme poverty. I know that we're doing terrible things to the climate, but I think we have to try and make things better. I think that that's a really important cause, the idea of trying to reduce the amount of suffering in the world for all sentient beings, trying to produce a better society where there aren't people in extreme poverty, where we don't destroy our planet, make it very difficult for many people to survive. And the fact that I feel I can reach quite a wide audience and can make a difference there is something that gives me the energy to keep going. And one of the things we're doing on the podcast, by the way, is talking to people who have made big differences. And what we want to do is inspire other people to realize that they can make a big difference. You know, we've talked, most recent interview we've released is one with Kate Grant, who didn't actually found, but was a very early CEO of something called the Fistula Foundation, which repairs a birth problem called obstetric fistula, which happens in women who give birth in low-income countries with no medical assistance. The baby gets obstructed in emerging. Labor takes a long time, and even if the baby does emerge and does survive, which it may not, the baby kicking and trying to get out wears a hole in the uterus, often between the uterus and the bowel, or the uterus and the bladder. The woman is incontinent as a result, and essentially living in poverty in a low-income country, her life is ruined because she can't keep clean. Her husband may throw her out because he doesn't know what to do with this person who smells badly. But this is a repairable condition. This is something that a relatively simple surgery can fix in at least 95% of cases. So Kate Grant came to this tiny organization, and which was just helping one hospital that was trying to deal with patients with fistula, and transformed it into a global organization that sometime this year will treat its 100,000th patient. So 100,000 women who essentially their lives have been transformed. They've gone back, able to go back to a normal life, because of the determination of Kate Grant and volunteers who she mobilized to do something about this problem. And, so I hope that'll be an inspiring story that other people will think, gee, what can I do? Where do I have opportunities to really make a difference? And I think it's wonderful what people can do, and that should be celebrated and should inspire other people to try to do more themselves.
And is this Kate Grant episode going to be episode 8, 9, or 10? Just so
it's just been released, so I'm not sure what number it is. But if you go to wherever you listen to your podcasts, Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or anywhere, you can Google it. Lives Well Lived is the name of the podcast, and the most recently released episode, it was released last Thursday, would be the interview with Kate Grant.
Love it. And I remember sort of hearing her story when reading your book, A Life You Can Save.
That's right, she's in the book too. Yeah.
In your book, Peter, you sort of give these sort of brackets on how much people should give at different sort of income brackets. You also talked about sort of like the donating of a kidney, because the chances of having one less kidney causing any issues is near to zero. How have you sort of applied these lessons you've shared, and has these philosophies successfully passed down into your children and grandchildren? Because a lot of these are pretty like hard philosophies. Like, I'd be scared to give away a kidney.
Well, I must admit I haven't given away a kidney myself. I admire those people who do, but that's a step I haven't taken. What I have done is give away significant portions of my income. Varies a bit from year to year. Sometimes it's a third, sometimes it's been close to half, sometimes it's been a bit less when for some reason or other the money has been short. But I think that's something that, yes, I have passed on to my children, the idea that they're fortunate and that they can give something. So I think that's important, that anybody above a fairly minimal level of material sufficiency can do something for others. And that's because of the vast difference in income between people in wealthy countries. So Australians, for example, a lot of people, I'm sure your friends and people I know, go to cafes and buy nice coffees and sit around for a bit chatting, and with what they pay just for that, not even a meal, that would well be more than what some people in the world, hundreds of millions of people in the world, in fact, have to live on for an entire day. So if you think about, you could save a little bit on what you're spending in cafes, and add that up over a year. That'll be somebody's income. You could donate that through Give Directly, one of the organizations that is recommended by the Life You Can Save, that actually gives cash to people. For every $100 you give directly, $90 will go to a person who is extremely poor. And Give Directly, it has to take 10% to administer, but one of the things it does with it is it follows up and sees what happens to people who receive these cash grants, and sees that generally they are better off. They don't spend it on booze or gambling or prostitution or whatever else people might imagine that poor people would spend a sudden influx of cash on. They mostly spend it on things that protect them, that stop the rain coming in their leaky thatched roof, that educate their children, that feed their children better. So it's you don't have to be rich to make a difference to somebody's life. You just have to be your average Australian who spends a good part of their income on things that they really don't need.
When you sort of shared, giving away 50% of your sort of yearly income, it sort of makes me think of, I hear about this future where no one's going to own anything. You're not going to own a car, you're not going to own a house. You just use an Uber, you rent your home, you rent your phone, and that's already sort of happening. Is this like a good future? Like, I can't tell if this is a utopian or dystopian type of future.
I don't know. I actually don't see this happening as widely as you just mentioned. I can see that people may find it more effective not to own a car, but to use an Uber, because there's a lot of costs in inefficiency in having cars standing around in the street, not being used. So maybe you don't need those basic costs, and we can do better with an Uber. But in terms of people's homes, I think there may be more people renting, but there's certainly still people who think it's important to own their own home. But I don't have any particular expertise on which of these arrangements is better. I suppose people will decide what they're more comfortable with and what suits their needs better, and that will depend on a variety of technical developments. Like the existence of Uber depends on the internet services that enable us to get an Uber really quickly, more or less wherever we are. So it's really hard to predict what direction we're going to go into with other things, whether they're going to go in that Uber-like direction or remain more matters of ownership.
Yeah, I'm just like thinking how everything's a subscription now. You're paying every month to get a bit of it, I guess. Talking about sort of ownership and having more people, always like population is going to always increase. One thing I've always struggled to understand was sort of the concept of overpopulation. The World Economic Forum, Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, they talk about overpopulation, and they talk about the Great Reset. Like, is it true that there's too many people in the world, and is this a real thing?
No, I think this has changed, actually. I don't think these people are talking about overpopulation that much anymore, because most of the world is now starting to the numbers of people being born are now below the replacement level. That's true of, if you're talking about natural fertility rates, that's true of pretty much all the affluent countries. Countries like the United States and Australia, where population is growing, it's immigration that is causing the populations to grow. It's not natural reproduction. And in some countries, Korea, Japan, but also China, the predictions are the population will fall quite significantly by the end of the century. So some of these countries are now talking about underpopulation. The South Korean government, for example, is paying pretty hefty baby bonuses to people to have more children, because they're worried that the population will decline to a level where there aren't enough young people to help look after and earn money to care for the older people. So I think things have changed in most people's thinking. The exception is sub-Saharan Africa, where population is still growing quite fast. And so I think one might want to talk about slowing population growth in sub-Saharan Africa to protect the environment and to improve living standards. But that's really the exception. There's not many other places where you would be concerned about overpopulation.
Interesting. Is it like does less people mean less poverty as there's more resources to go around? And can we supplement the lack of sort of manpower with robots? Like, is that sort of the goal, or do we want to have more people because more people means more happiness?
Yeah, I mean, there will be some environmental benefits clearly from having fewer people. There'll be less pressure on nature and forests and biodiversity. Maybe fewer greenhouse gas emissions from fewer people, although that will still depend on how they produce their energy. But yeah, there's something to be said for having, if we can provide for the basic needs of people, there's something to be said for, and if we can do it in a sustainable way, there's something to be said for not letting population fall too much, simply because if people are living well, why not allow more people to live well? That sounds like a good thing.
Got it. And it made me sort of think about your book, sort of One World. Is that related to globalist, like a globalist? Like, what is a globalist and what do globalists believe in? Or is it not related at all?
No, it is related to that topic. So essentially, One World was written basically around the turn of the millennium, so around 2000. And most of it was written before September 11th, 2001. So it was somewhat optimistic in thinking that we were moving towards a more global world, that we were moving, for example, to a world of greater free trade, a world of law. International law was strengthening. The International Criminal Court had been set up. We needed clearly to have global solutions to climate change because this was obviously a global problem. And I was hopeful that we were having global solutions to extreme poverty in the world as well. So I wrote about all of those issues in One World. And but after 9/11, it started to be more difficult. We had a clash of cultures there, and then the World Trade Organization did not succeed in implementing freer trade for various reasons and quite legitimate protests against some of the things that were happening. And then more recently, of course, we've had Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which was certainly a blow to the idea of international law. And now we have the crisis in the Middle East, which is another example of that. So I think that it's become more difficult to hope for global governance or a truly cosmopolitan approach to the world than it was back in 2000.
Is sort of the leading globalist, I guess, team the United Nations, the UN? And I guess the UN is like funded by BlackRock, which owns a bit of everything.
No, where do you get that from? The UN is not at all funded by BlackRock.
Oh, it's not. Okay.
No, that's nonsense. The UN is funded by contributions from governments, but it actually is very poorly funded. It's the UN has far fewer funds than any government of any affluent country.
Is UN also completely different to NATO?
Completely, yes.
Talking about climate change, one thing I always questioned was that if Earth could be hit with an asteroid and it sort of caused all the dinosaurs to be extinct and a bunch of carbon in the air, probably fires, everything, tsunamis, and Earth was able to recover to where it is now, does that mean all the irreversible damages we're sort of causing day to day can be reversed and go back to normal if we recovered from an asteroid?
Well, over 60 million years, the planet recovered from an asteroid. If you want to wait 60 million years, yes, in fact, probably a lot less than that. But we could still basically lose all the progress we've made. It's possible. I don't think it's likely, but on the most extreme scenarios of climate change, the planet could become uninhabitable for human beings. There may be some life that survives, but in which case then we would lose all the advances of civilization. No doubt there would be still life, and in tens of millions of years it might evolve into intelligent life again. But that's a vast timescale when you think that all of human history is 10,000 years. To have to wait tens of millions of years is catastrophic enough. So in that sense, yes, climate change can be an immense catastrophe, which would do huge damage to all of us and to the planet.
Got it. Also in your book, The Life You Can Save, you talked about the story of a person driving a Bugatti, and if there's a train going by and there's a kid that's stuck on the train rack, like, should the driver put his Bugatti and stop the train and lose his Bugatti? If a Bugatti is worth $1 million, that person, like, would it have been smarter for that person not to damage his Bugatti and lose that one person and sell the Bugatti for $1 million and save 1,000 lives instead of that one?
Yes, that's a good response to the Bugatti dilemma that I talk about. But of course, the assumption is that this person just loves and cares for the Bugatti and isn't going to sell it for those purposes. But is faced with the choice of the child in front of him or the Bugatti being destroyed. And in that situation, maybe he would choose the child. Whereas if he just had the Bugatti and somebody said, look, you could sell this and save 1,000 lives, he would not do it. But you're right, the rational thing to do would be, I guess, not to let the Bugatti be destroyed, but to sell it and to use the money highly effectively so that you could save a lot of lives. Might not be actually, just thinking about the organizations that The Life You Can Save recommends and the estimated cost of saving a life. It's around $4,000 for some of the more effective organizations. Still extremely little compared to what we spend to save lives in Australia. So it might be 250 lives that you are selling. 250 lives that you are saving by selling the Bugatti. But still, yes, that is better than saving just one life.
Yeah, and on that topic, like, after reading your book, like, I feel a bit selfish if I, say, spend $50,000 a year for my child's university tuition, whereas that $50,000 could save, I don't know, is that 10, 100 lives for the cost of one child's education?
Yes, but you have to think about what the child is going to do with the education, and maybe the education is still a good long-term investment because the child is hopefully going to live and work for another 50 years after they complete their education, and maybe we'll do a lot of good things, or maybe we'll just earn much more money and therefore be able to give a lot more than $50,000 to effective charities with that. So I would still encourage you to spend for your child's education, seeing it as a long-term investment.
Interesting. So, like, let's say someone like Jeff Bezos, he employs millions of people. These millions of people are allowed now have money to give their children tuition and education. He also gives people the ability to buy things online shopping for billions of people. Is building a company also deemed as good? And can we argue that is much better than giving a ton of money away, because he's creating jobs and creating families and children that now have education? And if so, is it fair that he rewards himself with a yacht?
So firstly, I mean, obviously, if Jeff Bezos hadn't built Amazon, he wouldn't have billions of dollars to give away. So if he does give billions of dollars away, then that's one good consequence of him having Amazon. Another good consequence, I admit, I use Amazon, is makes it very convenient to get books, to obtain books at lower prices maybe than I would otherwise. Also, with things like Kindle, to obtain them instantly when I want them. Yes, I think there's definitely great benefits from the existence of Amazon. There are also, of course, great costs. The workers are not generally well paid, so there are problems of that kind. You have to think about the environmental impact that Amazon is having. So there's a lot of different pros and cons to add up. But I think the question still is given now that he has established Amazon and has many tens of billions of dollars, what is the best thing for him to do with that? So some people might say, well, he could pay his workers better. That may be true, but he could also do a lot to help people in low-income countries. He could provide employment in those countries and could assist, as Bill and Melinda Gates did, like to prevent them becoming sick and dying through diseases that we can vaccinate for, or by providing clean water and sanitation so they don't get diarrhea. So there's a lot of things that can be done, and I think generally the best value is in low-income countries, just because, as I said before, they are so poor relative to where we are that we could double their income just by saving $3 or $4 a day and adding it up, and at the end of the year donating it to them. So I think there's a lot of things that Bezos could do. He has started giving some of what he earns away, and that's good. And some of that has gone to issues like climate change, which is very important. But in general, you would think that you will probably do more good in donating to low-income countries. Finding alternatives to factory farming would be another important thing to do, both for the animals and for the environment and the waste of food that is involved in growing food for factory farm animals. So there are many good opportunities for what you can do with your money, and I hope that billionaires like Bezos and others will think about that hard and use it wisely.
Another sort of thought I had after reading your book, Peter, was that you talked about the inefficiencies of food aid from the USA, where there's rules like if we're going to give food away, it has to be food that's manufactured in the US. It has to be shipped on a US flagged vessel.
You're right about the US flagged vessel, but the USA now does allow the purchase of food in the countries where it's distributed. It doesn't have to be produced in the US. Some of it is, quite a lot of it still is, but it's not an absolute rule. So they have loosened up a little bit on that. They've become aware of the problems that rule caused.
Got it. Yeah, because that sort of made me think, like, is it similar to how the Gates Foundation, like a lot of the pledge money is, distributing vaccines or other sort of technologies that Bill Gates is invested in. For example, like he's invested in Pfizer. So I guess it's like it makes sense to distribute vaccines to third world countries manufactured by Pfizer, but it's like this sort of loop where it's like, I guess he benefits from.
I have no knowledge of any investments that Bill Gates has in Pfizer. It's possible that he does, but I'm not aware of it. He's paying for a lot of research, as I said, into vaccines against malaria. That's not a profitable activity, because the people who you need to vaccinate against malaria overwhelmingly are people who are not going to be able to pay for it. So they're giving the vaccines away. So I think to impute sort of profit motives to Bill Gates for what he's done for the world and for the foundation is just a kind of an attempt to somehow blacken the reputation of a person who's done an immense amount of good in the world. I think people always like to kind of throw stones at people who are doing good, because it makes them feel guilty that they're not doing good themselves. So they say, oh, they're only doing it to make a profit from someone, but that's just not true at all.
One thing I really liked in his documentary was his one of the things he tried to solve was sort of sanitation. And he was sort of did this experiment where there was a bunch of people in a competition to try to convert, I guess, feces into clean drinking water. And I guess that was a big problem that he's trying to solve. Is that what causes a lot of sickness in these slums, the lack of a drainage and sewage system?
Yes, poor sanitation is a major cause of diseases in low-income countries, and it's often that there are no proper toilets at all. That there are trenches or pits or something like that, or maybe in some rural areas people simply randomly defecate around the countryside, and that can cause a lot of diseases. Actually, you can the toilet paper that we're using here is made by an Australian company called Who Gives a Crap. And if you read on that, it will tell you, I think, that there's 2.3 billion people in the world who don't have toilets, and 50% of the profits from purchases of Who Gives a Crap toilet paper are going to people in poverty to help them get sanitation. So, there's lots of good ways in which you contribute to making things better, and buying a brand of toilet paper that will help more people to get toilets is a good way of doing it.
With these third world countries, as sort of we become more, we get into industrialization, we get more technology, we need more labor, need more workers, we're going to generate more jobs. And we've seen this happen in many countries where industrialization just like eradicated poverty. I guess we see it in China. It sort of created a middle class. How can we attribute the decreasing amount of poverty to the money that's being donated each year, not attribute it to the industrialization that's happening globally?
Well, I'm not arguing that all of this decline in poverty is the result of money that's donated. I'm sure that a vast proportion of it is the result of industrialization and of opening up trade, and particularly in China, as you said. But there are people in extreme poverty who can't really benefit from that for various reasons. They don't produce anything that the wealthier nations want to buy. So China had the advantage of having a huge domestic market, which enabled it to sell domestically and produce goods and then export them. It also has a highly educated workforce. There are other countries that don't. China also, of course, has its own ports that it can export from. There are some very poor countries that are landlocked countries that don't have ports at all. They would have to transport anything they made through other countries, and some of those countries may also be poor and have very poor infrastructure. So it's quite difficult for them to actually physically get things that they make to the more affluent countries. So greater industrialization, opening up trade, is a good road to get people out of poverty, but it's not a sort of magic bullet that will work for everyone. And that's why we need to help people in extreme poverty have better lives, get some education, find ways of starting small businesses. They're not going to be helped in the same way that many, many millions of people in China and in a number of other countries have been helped.
Got it. One of the last takeaways I got from reading the book, I remember telling a friend, I was like, hey, like, imagine you're walking to work, you're late to work, you see a girl that's drowning, and you're late to work, you're wearing your new suit, you don't want to get it dirty, like, would you save that kid? And she said, yeah, of course. And I was like, yeah, like, it's crazy how as we speak there's someone potentially dying right now in a third world country, and we have the power to do something and save it, but we don't. But in that scenario you mentioned, it's evident that we're going to jump into the water, where ruin our shoes, go late to work to save that kid. And she said a probably more accurate metaphor for what is happening is that there's probably 50 people in the park and there's one girl drowning. So if you're late to work, it's okay for you to rush to work because there's going to be people around. And when she said that, I didn't know what to say. I didn't have a response. I was like, I guess you're right. But yeah, I didn't know what to say.
Well, the problem is that there's more than one child in the pond, of course. There are, as I say in the book, something like 5 million children dying every year from avoidable poverty-related causes. That's around 14,000 children dying every day. So yes, you can be quite sure that in the time that we have been talking, more than an hour, there have been, well, several hundred children have died from avoidable poverty-related causes. And while there are many, well, more than a billion affluent people who could help them, unfortunately they're not. And that's the point of the appeal that I'm making, that if you're one of these people living in an affluent country with money to spare, you can be helping. And if you're not, then you're not playing your part. So it wouldn't actually be very demanding if everyone were to play their part, if everyone were to say, fine, I'm affluent, I will give 10% of my income. That would be ample. That would do it if all the affluent people gave 10%. In fact, they wouldn't have to give 10%. If they gave maybe 5% or even less, it would be enough. So, but if many of them are doing nothing, if they're just bystanders standing around watching the other children drown without helping them, then I still think you should jump in and help, because these children are going to drown. If you don't help, there will be some children who would be alive if you help, who would not have been alive if you didn't help. And that's exactly the way it is in the world today now. If you help and donate to an effective organization, like one of those recommended by The Life You Can Save, you can go online and find them, then there will be children who are alive who wouldn't be alive if you hadn't donated, or depending which organization you choose to donate to, there may be people who can see again who would be blind if you hadn't donated, or there may be women who had obstetric fistula and whose lives were effectively ruined, who will have the fistula repaired. There will be people who work or given the support to work their way out of poverty and bring their families out of poverty, who wouldn't have been able to do that if you hadn't donated. So there are plenty of people who could donate, but there are not enough people who are donating. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to increase that. We need to make it part of the culture that if you want to live an ethical life, you have to do something. If you are a middle-class person in an affluent country, if you want to live an ethical life, you ought to be doing something to help these people. And if we can spread that idea, which is what I'm trying to do, then we will solve these problems.
I love that, Peter. The last two questions I usually wrap up these podcasts with. One, any recent discoveries that you've implemented into your day-to-day life?
Recent discoveries in my day-to-day life? No, I couldn't really say that there are. No, I guess in terms of my personal lifestyle, I've always tried to balance the academic work that I do, which involves a lot of sitting around at the computer or writing, with doing some physical exercise. So I suppose one thing that's a little different is I now do workouts that I see online, which is a kind of a bit of a routine, whereas I used to do other things that perhaps were somewhat less effective, maybe. I don't know. So you could say that that's a discovery. Thanks to the internet, I've got a wider range of possible workouts that I can do, and I'm enjoying that.
Do you still often go on hikes? I know that's one of your hobbies. I think I heard from somewhere.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, we do. Actually, we went on a hike. This last weekend we went on a walk, I would say, not a hike. But the weekend before that, we did a 17-kilometer hike, which was good fun. Very decent weather previous weekend. So yeah, we still do that when we can.
Any favorite hikes around the world?
There are lots of wonderful hikes around the world that I've been fortunate to do in my lifetime. Done some hiking in Patagonia, which is really fabulous. Very spectacular mountains and real wilderness. Been hiking in Europe, in the European Alps, which I really enjoy a lot of different places. I've hiked in New Zealand, hikes like the Milford Track, the Routeburn Track, the Kepler Track. So there's some beautiful places in New Zealand, and of course, many places in Australia. The Surf Coast Walk along the coast west of Melbourne has spectacular ocean scenery. I really enjoy that. I enjoy the mountains in Victoria as well. I particularly love Mount Buffalo, which is kind of a high granite plateau with a lot of unusual rock formations that my parents took me there as a child, and I've been there many times since, and always enjoy it.
When you go on hikes, do you listen to music, listen to audiobook? Do you just think to yourself? Do you be present and clear your mind?
Well, I'm usually not alone, and we talk a bit, but no, I enjoy being in nature and just observing nature as I walk.
I love that. Last question. Any personal goals or focus over the next 6 months? I know you have your sort of podcast and all the projects you mentioned, but any personal goals for the next 6 months?
No, I guess the two big projects, as you say, are the podcast and more generally, I guess, trying to improve my social media. I'm on Twitter or X, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn. I have this Substack, Bold Reasoning with Peter Singer, so I want to make them better known and get more time to write for them, and so build up my online presence, as well as the podcast that we've been talking about. So that's one goal for the next 6 months. I mentioned the trip to China. I would really like to spark some more discussion of ethics, and particularly of ethics relating to animals in China, because the treatment of animals there is a huge issue. It's such a big producer of animals, especially pigs now, by far the world's largest producer of pigs, and they're virtually all factory farmed. So I'd like to get more discussion about animal ethics in China going when I'm there. So, and I've got a book coming out in the United States about turkeys, which is a small book that is being released before Thanksgiving to get Americans to think about what they're eating for Thanksgiving. So I hope that that gets some media attention, and because again, all of these turkeys are factory farmed, and there are many horrible aspects to their lives that people have no idea about, that I hope the book will tell them about, and I hope it gets a lot of attention when it's released in October.
I love that. With your tour set up in China, when's that going to happen, and how did you get that tour set up? Like I know people like the Dalai Lama aren't allowed to go to China. You're definitely going to be talking about a pretty, I guess, topic that I don't know if the China people are okay with. How did that tour get set up?
Well, I have invitations from professors at a number of universities in China, and I think they believe that these are reasonable topics that they can be discussed in China, and I hope that the Chinese authorities think so too. I haven't yet got my visa, but I'm not really expecting problems in getting it, given that I have invitations from eminent professors at some of the best universities in China.
I love that. Peter, where can people get more of you? We'll link everything in the description below.
Thank you. Sure. Well, you can start with my website, petersinger.info. That's a good place to go, and that will give you a lot of information. You can get books, get some of my books there. You can, of course, get them other places as well. It will tell you about the podcast. Follow me on social media, on X, on Instagram, and Facebook, and you will get more information about what I'm doing. When I release a podcast, which is every Thursday, currently we're releasing a new episode, so people can look at that. And yeah, I think let's have a look at my Substack as well.
We'll link everything in the description below. Everyone, highly recommend guys to check out the links. Thank you so much for your time today, Peter. Like, I love how knowledgeable you are. You have such this wide range of sort of knowledge, and I can definitely feel that you've committed your life to learning as well as teaching. And I love how direct and you are, and you have this sort of contentness about you. So I really appreciate your time today, and thank you so much for coming on our show.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for helping me to spread the message that I'm trying to get across to the rest of the world. Appreciate it.
Guys, if you made it this far into the episode, hopefully you guys got some value, and I'll see you guys next week on another episode. Peace. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's amazing to have you back in Australia full time, and this was such a fun, insightful conversation.
Right, good. Thanks very much for all your questions.
Thank you very much, Peter. Have a great week.
Great, bye.